for Vacation Bible School, but I'm impressed with just your left hand, David. That was pretty good. So I want to start my sermon with a question, not for you, a question that I once heard. How do we know that they aren't hearing God's call better than we are? That was a question that the more practical theologian in the Henry House once asked me when, for the second time in 2 weeks, the same pastor nominating committee had contacted me to share the news that they were convinced that God was calling me to serve their congregation. I was fairly certain that God was not calling me to serve their congregation. But in response to 9 people in prayer so certain, my wife, Shawn Samuelson Henry, asked me a good question. How do we know that they aren't hearing God's call better than we are? Truth is, that word call is bandied about and used in a variety of circles, ecclesial included. It's an appellation that usually applies to things like this famous passage from Genesis where God calls Abram to move from a trading post on the road from Nineveh to go to the pasture lands in what would eventually be called Canaan. That word call has a meaning that seems to morph. It seems to morph depending upon who is using it. In some cases, it is a moniker to designate a mysterious experience of the living God. And in other cases, it seems like a theological stamp that's applied pretty late in the game, kind of like a holy travel agency. It's pastors and professional theologians working their way up ecclesial ladders with shorter and shorter stays, leaving each parish because they're called, coincidentally, they're called to higher pay, better benefits, a more prominent pulpit. Calls wear many masks, depending upon the intent of those who speak of the call, I suppose. Abram had a call, and in this case, it seems legit. It's a call that the writer of Hebrews makes famous centuries later when that writer penned these words. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Indeed, by faith, our ancestors received approval. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out from a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. He set out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he stayed for a time in the land that had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him. Therefore, from one person who was as good as dead, descendants were born, as many as the stars of heaven, the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. The Apostle Paul, writing around the same time as Hebrews, in his work on justification by faith, he also elevated Abraham and his answer to God's call as a primary call from God and our appropriate response. Paul said this, "No distrust made Abraham waver concerning the promise of God. He grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, being fully convinced that God was able to do what God had promised. Therefore, Abraham's faith was reckoned to him as righteousness." Paul continues, "Now the words, 'it was reckoned to him,' were written not for his sake alone, but for ours also. It will be reckoned to us who believe in him who raised Jesus, our Lord, from the dead." It seems that despite the incredible nature of a voice that's heard and the immense journeys that are sometimes undertaken and the routine dramatization of such calls by preachers in pulpits, thus making them implicit norms for our listeners, it seems that despite this, the primary call of God is to faith. The primary call of God is to faith, which is a fusion of both trust and belief, as well as hope and action. And this call is not always spectacular, despite some of our yearnings for it to be so for us. Presbyterians in particular, we consistently say that call comes to the individual, but it's manifest and confirmed in community. The people who know you saying, "Have you thought about, I think you should, would you consider?" I know for me, During my junior year of college, when other people go abroad, I went back home. I wasn't certain what would be for me after graduating from the University of Illinois. It was Sunday school teachers and other members of my church consistently saying, "We thought you would be going on to seminary to become a minister." That was God's call for me, not a voice from heaven. It was a voice from the first row and from the narthex of the church. Calls don't always come as voices from the darkness. They can and usually do come from ordinary sources. For the mundane and the banal are as surely part of the realm of God's activity as the mysterious and the spectacular. The same God who made the Milky Way to shine also set the ocean tides to their eternal ebb and flow. The one who intricately loops the lace of a snowflake with but the brief breath of a cool winter wind also pounded out the sand on the shore over eons of time. The one who gilded the lily also used muck and mud to create human beings. The God of Jesus Christ works in the realm of the quotidian as surely as God works in the realm of the exceptional. Therefore, answering the call often involves patience. Patience as we look and listen for the call. Now, because we're Presbyterian, we know patience and looking and listening and waiting doesn't mean being inert and still. After all, what did Abraham do while waiting for the call to be heard again? Well, he shepherded and he tended to his flock. He adjudicated the needs of those in his household. And despite our commonplace retelling of the tale of Abram as if the call to this journey was out of the blue, he was finishing a journey that his father had already begun. It was his father who left modern-day Iraq to go to Canaan, stopping in Haran in modern-day Turkey. And then Peter, after the resurrection, according to the Gospel of John, where does Jesus find him to give him his commission? Peter's looking and listening by doing what he knows to do. He's fishing at the Sea of Galilee, keeping himself busy while waiting for the call. Now, while answering the call involves patience, it also involves development as we await the call of God. Development sometimes comes from trial and error, from trying things out. I learned this week that 80% of college students change their majors while they're in college. 80% change their major. Some studies would tell you that the average American worker, get this, has 12 to 15 jobs before the age of 40. And those of us of a certain age, we have former students and children who are in jobs that did not exist 15 years ago. Some of us are in jobs that are going to change with the effects of AI. No matter how many majors or jobs we have, no matter how much artificial intelligence might change what we do, when it comes to answering the call of God in our lives, as many are fond of saying, God equips the called more than God calls the equipped. Some of you learned that when you literally answered the call from a friend who was in emotional or spiritual need. And you didn't think you were up to the task, but God gave you the gift of compassion that your neighbor needed at that moment. And then some of you are answering the call of God through things as mundane as a committee, finding there a ministry that fits with your gifts and skills of a lifetime. Meanwhile, we all know that the relationship skills we develop over time are transferable from places like Davidson to as far away as Nicaragua and Kenya or to Memphis, places where our mission trips are going this summer. Our transferable gifts of love are needed in all of those places, and we might find that we get to share them in those places and more when some of our fellow members come back from their trips this summer and they look you in the eye and say, you should go next year when we go again. For as much as we might dream it to be otherwise, we are not all Abram with a voice from heaven. We are not Percy Jackson and his fellow demigods with their Greco-Roman mythological friends appearing through the mist to call us on our quest. We don't hear Mrs. Whitsitt telling us about tesseracts. Nicholas Flamel does not work in the bookshop where we work. Owls don't come through the windows with letters of admission to Hogwarts. Our sisters' names aren't drawn from the Hunger Games lottery. Gandalf doesn't show up at our doorstep with dwarves in tow. We don't step through wardrobes with our siblings and enter Narnia The voice of Obi-Wan Kenobi does not tell us to go to the Dagobah system. We have calls and journeys, to be sure, but with all due respect to Joseph Campbell, our calls are not always as dramatic as those laid out by the masters of fiction and the writer of Genesis. For many of us, most of us, children awake with fears that need to be assuaged. Spouses turn to us for comfort when their parents die. Friends come to us in the midst of their divorce, and community organizations have holes to fill. Brief side note, I recently was pointed to a study that says in the United States, approximately 25% of Americans view being involved in their community as very important. 25%, down from 60% as recently as just a few years ago. So for most of us who aren't Abram, the call comes sometimes through community organizations with holes to fill, where Little League teams need coaches and schools need mentors, community gardens need tending. Meanwhile, all of us have friendships to celebrate, anniversaries to commemorate, communities that elevate one another and inspire us to serve God and answering our calls together. And in the midst of all of these calls is the primary call to trust. That's the real root of the word we translate faith, to trust that God will be present and active in the various ministries in which we serve, whether those ministries bear the stamp of church or simply that of husband and wife and partner and parent and grandparent and child and neighbor or friend. All of these ministries to which we are called. And call is not necessarily a voice out of the blue or some sublime sense of God's presence breaking through. It is us being present and available to the needs of the world and those around us. God calls, go. And sometimes the distance is no more than the arm's breadth between us and the weeping neighbor. Sometimes the distance to go is no further than the emotional turn to the neighbor in need. It's no higher than the shared joy of singing together in the presence of God. It is no deeper than the mutual sense of awe that binds us unto one another as we seek to be agents of the love of God. For while Jesus Christ is first fruit, we are part of the foretaste. And what we do here and everywhere matters. Every Sunday, every day, every relationship, every ministry, every minister, and in our theological tradition, every one of you is a minister of the grace of God. And in God's call in the world, every minister matters. Not because we control the Spirit, but because we can be a catalyst through which the Spirit's chemistry is started and quotidian calls to love and action can be answered. For call wears many masks, depending on the people God chooses to use to issue the call, but the intent of the call is always the same: to trust, to love, to be loved, to be here wherever here is. Be here and know that you are called. In the name of the Father and the Son